Sony has been known for so much more than just the PlayStation franchise. In the early 90s, Sony was known for their technology, such as televisions or even audio interfaces, such as the Walkman. And before I get any further in the video, I'd just like to say that I've noticed that 99.6% of my viewer base are not subscribed, so if you do enjoy the content you see, we are almost at 400 subscribers, and it would be greatly appreciated if you could consider pressing that subscribe button. But with that out of the way, let's continue on with the video. In the 1990s, Nintendo were looking to have a DVD reader being placed into their next Nintendo console for the sake of having more space and storage for their games. Looking for a new way to implement this, Nintendo went to Sony. Sony already had the technology to help Nintendo have their DVD reader inside of the console. But after a while, Nintendo got a bit scared. Knowing that Sony owned the rights to the DVD reading technology, Nintendo were unsure as to whether to continue developing their new console with Sony, as if their new console earned major profits, then Sony would still own the copyright to that DVD development technology and therefore earn a formidable amount of the profits. And the sad thing is that Nintendo gave no indication whatsoever to Sony that they were unsure about the continuous development of the Nintendo-Playstation and the fact that they were looking to other companies to help develop their CD technology for their new Nintendo console. Now, as good as Nintendo are usually praised to be, Nintendo actually went behind Sony's back and went to Philips to help develop their DVD technology for their new Nintendo system, and Sony was furious and wasn't too sure what to do. And after many arguments with the higher-up developers at Sony, they eventually decided to create a console that would rival Nintendo's next console, that being the Sony-Playstation. But the main reason why Sony hadn't already ventured into the console market was because they said that they weren't a gaming console company. They didn't want to create video game consoles because at the time they were stereotyped for children, and that was one of their main focuses when making the Sony PlayStation, most commonly known as the PlayStation 1, as they decided to go for a more adult route with the style of games that they would create for the Sony PlayStation. At this point in time, Sony went to design the PlayStation 1, but mainly to compete with the other brands such as Sega and Nintendo, who at the time were the reigning kings of consoles, and as soon as the PlayStation 1 hit the store shelves, it basically knocked Sega right out of the console competition and just basically left Nintendo and Sony to fight to the death as to what would be the best console of that gaming generation. And at this point in time, Nintendo and Philips had stopped working together on a brand new console that would incorporate DVD functionality instead of cartridges, and that led Nintendo to create their next console, which would be the infamous N64 with a cartridge system, which led to many games that people were developing to be shifted to the PlayStation 1, as the PlayStation 1 could hold so much more memory due to their DVD system and also their memory cards. And surprisingly for Sony, this ensured that most developers would move their games from Nintendo to Sony's PlayStation, most formidably with Final Fantasy VII, which had primarily been a Nintendo exclusive. But since the PlayStation 1 had so much more graphical power and storage, that the developers of Final Fantasy VII decided to shift it to the PlayStation 1, which, on the storage side of things, was the superior console. In 1994, the Sony-Playstation was released and has now become one of the single most important consoles in gaming history, and has the third highest sell rate of consoles out of every single console that has released ever. And it's just so amazing to see in retrospective how far Sony has come from 1994 to 2020 and the amount of consoles and games that they have released. It's just absolutely incredible. And it wasn't just the DVD technology that helped push Sony to become one of the biggest console makers out on the market even today. It was also the fact that they paved the way for 3D games rather than the standard 2D games that dominated gaming at the time. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Sony invented 3D games, but they certainly popularized them with games such as Metal Gear Solid, Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, and even Tomb Raider. All games that had major 3D technology that helped craft and create such amazing and memorable environments. When I first played Spyro as a child, I was absolutely blown away by the world, and even though these graphics may be blocky compared to today's standards, at the time they were absolutely amazing and beautiful and colourful, and that's much the same with other mascots like Crash Bandicoot. But games that went for a more adult route had a more serious colour palette tone, but also a graphical tone, such as Metal Gear Solid and Tomb Raider as said previously. And as I noted previously, Sony went for a more adult route with their console. They wanted to make the stereotype that gaming was just for children to be non-existent. And you could almost say that PlayStation did what Nintendo don't. Nintendo went for a more child-friendly approach to their games such as Mario and Zelda, but PlayStation went for a more adult route with games that portrayed violence in a graphical nature, especially for the time. Although Nintendo did have games like Mortal Kombat that did portray a fair amount of violence, PlayStation took it to the next level with Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, and once again Metal Gear Solid, and many more games, but games that I haven't necessarily played and therefore can't vouch for them. Another topic that I'd like to get onto with Sony is their advertisements for the original PlayStation. Their adverts were a far cry from the generic adverts for other gaming consoles, and instead went for a more artistic or even expressionistic. These adverts have become very infamous with the PlayStation brand, and even after the PlayStation 1, especially with the PlayStation 3 that has sort of bled into the PS4, their adverts are very strange, especially if you remember the baby advert from the PS3 era. That was certainly an advert that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. But anyway, they chose a very bold way to advertise their console, and I think that was a very brave thing to do, to step out of the boundaries of the generic adverts for consoles and try something new, which got people talking about these adverts and the product that was in these adverts, which therefore led to how big Sony has become today. These adverts weren't catered to children, they were catered to teenagers and adults who could really understand the message behind these advertisements, and therefore it appealed to the demographic that Sony wanted to push for the PlayStation, which was an older audience rather than an audience full of children, because they wanted to create games that were for that older audience. Sony changed many things in gaming as we know today, but there are also small differences that they made that have influenced how we play games even today. These things have made a big difference, such as having 2 analog sticks, and I know the original model of the PlayStation's controller didn't have any analog sticks and instead you had to move with the D-pad. They eventually released a model of the controller that had a dual analog stick configuration, which allowed for a more fluid experience when playing 3D games. And it's amazing to think that that dual analog stick configuration is still being used today. Think of how different each controller used to be for every single console. You look at the Super Nintendo and then you look at the N64's controllers. They are vastly different to each other, and the N64 eventually had an analog stick configuration but only a singular analog stick. And it's just so crazy now that even consoles like the Switch and the Xbox and the PlayStation all have dual analog configuration, whether that be offset or not. And even the use of memory cards, which are even now to some degree being used today, these memory cards allowed you to save more game data, more progress on more games, which therefore allowed you to expand your library so much further than what you would have initially been able to do with other consoles. And you could argue that this technology is not really being used today, but the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One all have external hard drive capabilities, and although they might not be as small or compact as what they once was, they are still being utilised. And to be fair, even the Xbox 360 and PS3 had some utilisation of this memory card system, and with the PS5 and Xbox Series X, there will be external SSD capability that will allow you to store more games on the console than the storage initially provides. It's just so amazing to see the journey that Sony has been on, from helping Nintendo to create the Nintendo-Playstation to now becoming one of its leading competitors. It's just so incredible to see how far Sony has come and how much they have achieved by just having a rivalry with Nintendo that has now sparked so many console generations and amazing games from the PlayStation brand. And Sony is one of the big powerhouses when it comes now to first-party titles, and you could just say that that is all thanks to Nintendo, who split off from Sony and allowed Sony to create a massive empire based around the PlayStation brand. And that's the story of how PlayStation changed gaming forever and shaped certain things in gaming that we now know today. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy, then subscribe and turn on that notification button so you don't miss another upload from me. So thank you, and goodbye.